Dr. DeAun Nelson, and I invite medical professionals to listen as I discuss how shifting the focus off of weight in healthcare can greatly improve health outcomes for patients of all sizes. I will explore what it means to practice in a weight-inclusive paradigm and discuss tools to implement these ideas in practice. Keep in mind that the information I will present may be new to many of my listeners and may sound radical to some, but stick with me. This information could change the lives of your patients. The fat acceptance movement itself has focused on reducing and eliminating fat bias and fat stigma, and thus improving overall health. And I wanted to go into more depth on that. And I am really excited because I'm being joined today by my guest co-host, Shilo George, who is an educator and activist, and actually really an awesome person too. So I'm going to have Shilo introduce herself so she can give us a better introduction than I can.
Hi, thanks. I'm really excited to be here and talking on your podcast. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm Shilo George, and I'm Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, as well as Scottish and Irish. And I am an educator and an activist, a fat activist in particular. And I am here doing work with people of size around how to advocate for themselves in life in general, and specifically in medical systems, and then also starting to work with providers and medical systems that are interested in really gaining a deeper awareness of the harm that fat stigma is having on their patients and health outcomes, and looking at different ways to work collaboratively with patients. And so because of this, I've created a small business. It's called Thluch Kom'tax Tamtam Consulting. And that means a great awakening of the heart and spirit in Chinook Wawa, which is the indigenous trade language from here in Portland, these Multnomah lands.
Awesome.
So I want to honor, because I'm Cheyenne, so I'm not from these lands, I'm a guest. So I want to honor the ancestors that are here and the people that are here in all the work that I do, because that's one of the main reasons that I have come into my power to be confident enough to stand up for myself, is because of the cultural traditions that have been given to me.
That's awesome. And I will put that information in the show notes so you can, and you can contact her. So
yes.
So yeah, today's episode is going to be a little more freeform than our previous episodes have been, because Shilo and I have both had different experiences with medical providers, and we wanted to... We just had a long conversation about this before recording, actually. We wanted to really be able to explain some things about being a fat patient and the actual experience that fat patients do have, and then also the things, sort of from a more personal point of view, the things that medical providers can do and to support their patients even more. I mean, I know we've talked about that in past episodes, but I want to do more. And then also things that medical providers should avoid for sure with patients, and how being a fat patient, being a fat person in society can really be a challenge, which we talked about in the weight stigma episode, but then it also can provide quite a bit of resilience. And that's something that I think we often forget as fat people, as providers, and just remembering those things. So yeah, we've got a variety of stuff to talk about. Yeah, we'll just jump into it.
Yeah, I think
see whether the conversation takes us.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's going to be really organic, and you've done a fantastic job in laying a very specific and strong framework.
Thanks.
For practitioners, and so I think it will be interesting for folks who are listening to get a perspective of the life that fat people often live, and our perspectives and our challenges, as well as our resiliency and brilliance. And I think that's important for providers to know how amazing and strong and powerful we are.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be also important. And the reason I wanted to, when I mentioned in the intro about the fat acceptance movement, is because that movement has been so integral in just reminding people that they're good people, and that they're worthy people, and that they should be a part of society, and society should allow them to be a part of society. The fat acceptance movement is more of a civil rights movement, but the civil rights movement in the past in other oppressed and marginalized groups has also done a lot to support the medical communities in serving those communities better. And even in other communities, there's still a lot of work to be done. But certainly I think that the fat activism movement has been a little slower in moving forward. It's been going on for a long time, much thanks to all the people who started it, but it has definitely been a slower slog, I think. And I think it's really important to know, a little bit about that, and then a little bit about why it's important for your patients to dial into that and to dial into the real body positive movement, to really be able to connect with their bodies. And we were talking about this really briefly about how somebody's not going to just wake up tomorrow and feel great about their body, but to be able to continually remind patients and friends and family too that they're important and needed in society, regardless of what society says of our bodies.
What you're saying is really important and powerful, that it is really challenging as a fat person. And I want to be really clear about, because you can't see what I look like. So I'm around 450 pounds. So I'm not a chubby person by any means. I am what in fat community we call super fat. So there's different kind of labels. It's almost like a spectrum of sort of like chubby people, or people who are sort of on that edge, and then medium-sized fats and super fats. And what is kind of unique about someone who's super fat is that you often find that chairs don't fit you really anymore, that places in public become very difficult to fit into. If I drive in a friend's car, most likely their seatbelt is not going to fit me. It's difficult to find clothing. Like, there's one store I can get clothing in this town, and I don't like the clothing there. And they literally have maybe 5 items that are in my size in the whole entire store. So most of the shopping I have to do online, which is also still extremely limited.
Right.
And so it's just every day, like your size impacts your accessibility and throughout the day. It's not something that every once in a while happens. So that's the space that I occupy as a fat person. And all of the messages that I get from society, that I get from oftentimes from family, although that's changing a little bit with the education that I'm doing with my family. Always educating people.
So much work.
Yeah. So media, society, work, not my current job, but in the past, other jobs that I've had, is this constant, you're too fat, you need to lose weight, you shouldn't be eating that. And all of that becomes internalized, and it's really hard to find your own self-acceptance. It's really hard to find that space to even care about your body. And most of us aren't just fat people. We're also people of color. We're also people with disabilities. We're survivors of abuse. We are people with, we're LGBTQ. Like, we've got all of these different identities. Usually it's not just fatness. So we're navigating multiple oppressions at the same time. And many of those oppressions are, have foundations in the same thing of sexism and racism and colonization and things like that. So,
and even those communities that you can access, like, as with those different communities, there is also a layer of fat phobia in those communities.
Absolutely.
So even when you're in your community where you're supposed to feel safe and loved and cared for, you don't always feel that way.
Exactly.
Because you're fat still. Yeah. And that is problematic for a lot of people.
Exactly. So you're trying to navigate the world, and then there is a lot of, I would think that people listening to this podcast understand the really extreme health issues that come into play with toxic, constant stress, which is trauma, and how that it affects our health outcomes. But then I'm blamed for being fat, and that I'm not doing enough. And then why is that? And you should be caring about yourself. well, why the hell should I care about myself when I'm constantly getting messages that I don't matter and that I only matter if I lose weight, if I look a certain way, if I'm not losing weight, that I'm obsessively doing everything I need to be doing all day long to be thinking about losing weight. And so I think it's one of those things that's important for people who don't have experience with having fat bodies or dealing with weight issues, or even some who have, is that how am I supposed to love myself or accept myself when I don't have very many examples of it in the world, except for the fat movement.
Exactly. And that provides that safe space. And it might not be safe for all of your identities, but and when I say you, I mean general you, but that does provide a safe space, at least for the size of your body. And I just wanted to go back a little bit when we were talking about like not fitting into the world. And that's something that I think, we forget about that a lot of times, I think as providers, but even as just folks, just going out there and doing our things, that we forget that not being able to, easily find a restaurant where you can sit in the chairs, or a movie theater, or a live theater. I've had issues with live theater chairs, and they're so frustrating. And so that really cuts out a lot of social life and social interaction that we know is really important for health, right? To be able to have a community and be able to connect with people. And so when those things are kind of shut out, or you're anxious about them all of the time, like you're like, how do I manage this? How do I manage this? Having a group and groups of people that you can go to and just be like, oh, this is just where I am. And it's fine. And I'm fine. Gives a little bit of solace. I've talked before about having a doctor's office be a place of sanctuary for someone who is fat. But then I think also being able to hopefully provide resources to the fat acceptance movement and the fat activist movement to provide some of that community that's often so lacking would be a really great thing for providers to look into, right? To say, hey, I have this place where you can go, or I know these people, or a Facebook group, there's nobody in town. So yeah, and that can support mental health and social health and all that good stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then also when you're talking about things going beyond the individual, that brings up healthism, right? Mm-hmm. And we had done I had done a whole thing on healthism. And the assumption that a fat body is diseased, which of course, because the AMA has decided we're diseased, which is frustrating to me, and I've mentioned that before, that creates this expectation that it's your fault that you're quote unquote diseased, and that there's nothing else but what you do that makes one's body the way it is, right? But that is not true. I mean, like we were just talking, like societal pressures, stress, all of these things that make it harder and harder to function in society, or particularly people who are much larger, doesn't take into account that, society is constantly causing more problems than it's fixing, or that the healthcare system is causing more problems than it's fixing, and that health is way more than just what I, put in my mouth and how much I sleep and how much I exercise. It's way more than that. And most people who are thinner have access to more of the things that support health, or are not barred from being a part of that, or not being shamed because their body looks a certain way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and when I've done some looking into healthism, it's really attached to neoliberalism and the sort of Thatcher Reagan administration, the trickle-down economics in the 1980s.
Personal responsibility.
Exactly. And I mean, I get that. And there is accountability is an important part of life.
Absolutely.
And also, I feel like it's gotten to the extreme that then society in general doesn't have to be accountable to help take care of people,
Right.
to help make sure the environment is clean, to take any accountability for abuse that continues
Right.
and is not addressed. Particularly talking about ACEs. Right. Which is a huge and important aspect to people's continued health throughout their lives. And we're not really addressing abuse and neglect. Right. And it's huge. And it's so epidemic. And if you want to talk about epidemics. And so instead, but dealing with abuse, right? Well, but trauma.
Just a second. I just wanted to clarify ACE is adverse childhood experience. Just for anybody who doesn't know.
Yeah,
just want to make sure. You. So we're not like, blah, 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 ACEs. And they're like, what are they talking about? Continue.
Yeah. So and ACEs is this study that was done in the 1990s around 10 adverse childhood experiences that they then correlated to some pretty serious health outcomes and early death. Mm-hmm. Has been repeated multiple times, but it does indicate health disparities and things like that. Although it's also important to remember that there is mitigating positive things that can happen so that not everybody dies early or gets really ill.
Right.
As well. It's a pyramid, not a square.
Right.
When they show the
because not an individual is the same.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Right.
Just have to make sure we say that.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of money to be made in addressing trauma in childhood and addressing things that are happening around abuse and how people are living. There's a lot of money involved with dieting and exercise and perfection and obsession. And I know that that's not what it's all about, but that is definitely a big piece of what's happening here.
It's a huge piece. It's a huge piece. And I mean, I feel like with everything, including obesity research, especially obesity research, it's really important to look where the money is, and say who's making money off of this.
And I would say also who is benefiting, which also could be money, and who is not benefiting. And I would say that would be the fat people.
Exactly.
Are not benefiting from this at all.
Absolutely. And it was interesting. I was listening to a thing about ACEs, and one of the first things that occurred to me after I finished watching it was a TED Talk, I believe, was that is it possible that as medical providers, we are actually contributing to those experiences, right? So I think that there probably could be a whole thing about medical adverse experiences that would be its own thing. But if you have a child who's already experiencing some issues at home, and then their pediatrician tells them that they're overweight or obese, and the parent freaks out and has a tendency towards maybe some abusive behavior, and then they're like, okay, so now we're not going to feed you. There are these things where the physician may not even realize that they're actually making things worse. And then not even thinking about kids coming from homes that are not abusive and not having problems, but then they're told they're fat, so they're put on their first diet, and so they've got the supportive home, but then they're being put on their first diet, and that starts them on potentially a very health negative trajectory, right? So could lead them to an eating disorder or increased weight, which is the problem with going on diets. And so, if we're causing, as medical providers, and the system is causing more problems, but then blaming the people who are experiencing the problems for their problems, that's a systemic issue, and that's
discrimination.
And it's discrimination.
Yeah.
And that's healthism, right? It's just saying it's all your fault.
Yeah. And it's toxic.
It is totally toxic.
And I think it's important for everybody, whether you're an administrator of a health system, or you're a provider, or you're a medical assistant, or you're the person at the desk, whoever is a stakeholder, what is my complicit behavior in this system? I think that when people start to realize, oh, wow, there's a lot happening here in this system. I see that this is really unhealthy for people, but, well, it's a system. I can't do anything about it. I think that there are things that we can do that are very, easy kind of initial things that can be done to be helpful to fat folks. And really, if we're looking at making spaces accessible both physically and emotionally and psychologically to fat people, that is also going to make things accessible to everyone else. Right, so we're, exactly. We're bringing everyone along with us. And so I think it's important as we kind of talk about this is that if you're starting to feel like, what can I do? There's actually a lot that can be done. And even little things, I think, can make a huge difference. Even if I've had a lot of negative experiences with providers and in medical systems, and I've also had some positive experiences. And those positive experiences, even when they're really small, make a huge difference to me because my standard of care my expectation is very low at this point.
Right.
So I'm just being really honest.
No, it's true.
My expectations are quite low. And so when somebody does something that's really thoughtful and centers who I am as a person and not my fatness, I notice it, and it makes a huge difference for me.
Can you talk about, we were talking before the podcast about the good experiences that you've had, because you can find tons of bad experiences online, and we'll probably talk about them in the future. But I want to hear the good experience you were talking about and how you created trust with your doctor, if you want to share that, and that actually helped you improve your health because you were able to over time talk to her more about what was going on with you that you didn't feel comfortable in the beginning. But once you established trust, and part of that trust was not assuming anything about your weight and not assuming anything about your habits just because of your size, all that stuff. So I really want to hear that story because I think it would be really informative to everybody.
I've been becoming more of a better advocate for myself over about the last 3 years. And I, for the last 2 years, have had a primary care physician. Her name's Kim, and she's a nurse practitioner. She's local here in Portland, and I absolutely love her. She is probably, I think, the best physician I've ever had, both just because she's good at what she does, but also she is extremely respectful and collaborative.
That's awesome.
So what I devised about 3 years ago is a 4-page document that I give to any kind of provider that I'm working with on a long-term basis. Basically, it has in it what my identities are. It has bullet points of these are some specific things that I expect from you as a provider to support my health and wellness goals. And they're things like weight loss surgery, dieting will never be part of anything about my treatment plan, and I don't want it discussed with me. Or another bullet point is I want to work collaboratively with my physicians and other people that are helping me with my health and wellness goals, and just to remember that you're one of several people in a constellation of people that are helping and supporting me. So those are kind of some of the bullet points for that. And then I talk a little bit about my skills, interests, and talents, because I want my providers to know what I have to offer, what skills I have, so that if we're working on an issue, that they can be like, oh, well, she's really good at keeping track of this or that, or she's really into understanding more about her body. So I'm going to present information in this way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Then I talk about my Body Sovereignty Project, which is a healing framework I've created for myself based on my cultural traditions, which I can talk a little bit more about if you want to hear that later.
Oh, yeah.
And then I have a specific list of my current health and wellness goals and where I'm at with them, and then maybe who is helping me with them. Okay. And so that's what I give to every provider that I work with, and I give it to them when I've come to see them for the first time, and I'm handing off my paperwork that has all my health history. And then I want them to read it before they come and see me in the room. And I've had to kind of convince office staff to do that. Because I, in particular, want them to read it before they've seen me.
Absolutely.
So it's just a different power dynamic. I want to shift power dynamics with the providers I work with. So I did that with Kim, and she walked in the room, and she's such a kind-hearted, very humble person. And she looked a little scared. And that's really common for providers when they've read that document, because I wrote it being very fierce and like this is my expectation. This is what I want to happen, and it better happen, or such and such is going to be the consequence.
Right.
Not that I'm going to hurt anyone, but I won't come back, or we'll have to have a conversation. So I just want to be real upfront. And so we discussed the document, and she said, I can totally abide by these expectations and guidelines. And so we had a conversation about that. And I was like, great, sounds good. So we worked together. I went to her for about a year, and I had a couple of issues that came up that she helped me address. And I don't trust providers when I first go to them because I've learned that I can't. And I, over a year, trusted her. She spends on average 45 minutes with me when I see her. And then for about so I'd been seeing her for a year. And then 4 years, I had these certain symptoms that had been getting increasingly worse. Some of them were like muscle fatigue, just being tired in general. And I think some issues with dizziness. So anyways, I was freaked out that I was diabetic, right? And so I was having this internalized paranoia for 4 years, getting worse and worse and worse. And I couldn't bring myself to talk to any of the providers about it that I was going to because I didn't trust them. And I was afraid of being a fat statistic and a fat stereotype and a Native American statistic. And having, diabetes, and I was freaked out about it. But after that year of working with her, I finally was like, I can't deal with the symptoms anymore. Like, I'm really worried. And so I went to see her, and I was like, I'm really scared, and these are my symptoms. And she said, well, those could be a lot of symptoms.
Yep.
That's not necessarily diabetes, by the way. And she's like, what do you think about, getting a blood test just all around so we can check everything? And I was like, okay, it scares me to do that, but I think I'm at the point of, okay, let's do this. And I just said, if I am diabetic, I don't know how I'd be good at making life changes and all of that. Like, it freaks me out. And she was like, there's a ton of things we can do, and we'll work on it. And she's like, but I'm not really convinced that you're diabetic because we haven't seen the labs. And I want to remind you all that I am like a very fat woman. I'm not chubby, right? So we do the labs. I come back a week later, and I'm so nervous and shaking. And she walks in the door and says, well, I got your labs back. Your A1C was fine. What happened is that your iron stores are really low, which was causing the symptoms. And I was like, what? Because I was convinced that this had happened to me because I've had so many scare tactics over the years from providers and just society in general about being fat and being diabetic that I thought it was inevitable to happen to me. And have actually had a negative experience with a provider in the past who was very passive aggressive with me about me not being diabetic. But she was wonderful, and it was such a great experience to be able to address that fear with her. And she was just positive and centered who I was, not the fatness. And if I was diabetic, she was just going to be like, well, that happens, right? And we will work on it, and we have lots of solutions. And I felt like it was amazing. And it was I think that should be how you care for people.
Absolutely.
And I don't think that people should be terrified to be shamed in going to their provider. And so I've continued to have a wonderful experience with her. But
absolutely. And something that really just stands out for me with this is that it took you a year of seeing her to create that trust. And she started on the first day. If she had not started on the first day, maybe you would have continued seeing her because, she seemed like okay, but you were still guarded. And so maybe it would have taken longer. And you would have had to put up, not only putting up with the symptoms, but putting up with the anxiety about the symptoms for longer. Who knows how long, right? Or maybe she would have been just another provider that you would have had to leave again, to find somebody else. And I really want to reiterate that to all providers out there. Sometimes it takes time, but it always takes time to build trust. But with your fat patients, it will take more time, because I can almost guarantee that anybody who comes in with a quote unquote BMI of like over 35, but probably even lower, is going to have had poor experiences at some point in their life with providers. It's inevitable. So knowing that, don't be the next provider that they're going to have a bad experience with. Just don't. Stop. If they don't do what Shilo did, which is so lovely, bring in a whole thing like, this is my stuff, this is what I need, this is what I can tolerate or not tolerate. I love it when patients do that, actually. But if they bring that in, they're giving you so much information right there. And so you can start exactly where Kim started. Start at the beginning. And then in a year or 6 months or 2 years or 5, however long it takes, your patient will be able to say, hey, I've been having this problem for the last while. Or maybe it was a problem they didn't even have before, but it's come up, and you can catch it earlier because you've already established that trust. So when they walk in, they're like, oh, something weird is happening. And then you find out they say they do have something that's going on. You can then address it immediately. That's my goal as a physician. And I would hope that that's everybody's goal.
And there is research out there that talks about the statistics of how often fat people wait to go to a physician, and how fat people in some circumstances end up having very serious medical conditions because they did not go when they were first having symptoms.
Right.
And then that gets blamed on them, when it's like, I'm seeing practitioners who, one, look at me and see my fatness and are like, you just need to lose weight. Or,
so even if
you're at all,
right? So even if you're going to the doctor, you're not getting treated, and so whatever's going on gets put off for another few years while you lose weight.
Right, and there's people. I've heard stories of people who have late stage cancer because it's not being diagnosed, and it's only the fat is the only thing. Oh well, you're having trouble with your breathing because you're fat. Well, actually, someone has cancer in their lungs, and
that's a problem. It's hard to breathe.
So, and I'm not saying that's happening all the time, but I know it's happening. And in fact, a woman who I got to present in a grand round at OHSU a couple of weeks ago, she talked about her son who died in his early 30s because he had undiagnosed diabetes and died of ketoacidosis, and because he didn't want to see a provider. I mean, this is the reality, and it's not just a couple fat people who don't want to go to the doctor. I mean, we're talking about
a lot of people.
I don't even know what the number is, but it's well over 1,000. Like, it's probably tens of thousands. I mean, I don't know.
Absolutely.
But it's extremely dangerous.
It is.
And it's a really big problem.
Absolutely. I have a colleague who saw a patient who was fat, and the patient came in short of breath and had to go up some stairs, and was giving her history, and the doctor realized that she had signs and symptoms of pulmonary embolism. And so, of course, sent her to the hospital and called ahead to the hospital and said, hey, this is what's going on. And so as soon as she got there, she was admitted, and it was a P, and they were able to handle it, and she was fine. She was absolutely fine. But I remember hearing this and thinking that I wondered if she had seen anybody else, somebody who wasn't looking past the fat, who was just seeing her as a fat patient, who was having a hard time, was breathing hard going up the stairs, and she had said, I don't normally breathe really hard going up these one flight of stairs. It wasn't that much. But would that person have died? Because she would have been sent home. Well, we'll just go start exercising more, and you're just not fit enough. Right. And I anticipate that there are probably quite a few people who have died because of that. And I often wonder, when we have these statistics about obesity killing people, right, because it's the fat that kills us, not, how often those deaths are due to negligence, basically. And not necessarily even intentional negligence, but just a blindness to anything besides the fat. And this push to just get rid of it and it'll be fine. When we know that doesn't work, number one, and we know that actually treating people does. And there's no way to know for sure. But I would not be surprised if we could find out that there were a lot of those, And I think at some point it will be considered negligence just to tell somebody to lose weight. I hope I see that in my lifetime. But I think it is important to think about when you see patients, to say, okay, if they were thin, what would I do? How would I see these symptoms?
Yeah, I think that there is differences with fat bodies, but I don't think there's such a difference. And I know I'm not a doctor, but I live in a fat body. I don't think that there's such a difference oftentimes with anatomy and physiology that fat people are completely different species, right?
Not.
So, yeah, I think it's becoming sensitive and aware of how you're seeing the fat patient. And then also what your own feelings are about your body and how you've been taught about your body. Are you someone who, is thinking about dieting all the time or, has judgments and thoughts about fat bodies, even if you don't want to have them, but they exist, right? Because we're all kind of brainwashed living in the society that we do. If you're not aware of what those biases are and, like you said earlier, constantly working on addressing them or being aware of them, I can guarantee you that if you think fat people are disgusting or you have moral
issues
right. Objections with it, that even if you're not saying those things auditorily, that it is coming through your nonverbal communication.
Absolutely.
Because I know there is a look that I have seen from providers or a tone of voice that lets me know that they don't like my lifestyle, that maybe they think that I'm the cause for my fatness and why I'm there that day. It absolutely comes through, and it is really upsetting to be the target of that. And it is a microaggression, meaning that it's an aggressive thing, but it's kind of subversive.
Right.
It is still there. And especially as a survivor of abuse, I am extremely aware of how to stay safe. And a lot of times for me, it's psychologically and emotional safety, not necessarily physical safety. Although as a woman, I'm constantly
trying to be aware of that too. Right.
But it's the psychological and emotional safety that I'm always looking at people and looking at their nonverbal communication to know if I need to be defensive,
right,
and take care of myself. Right. And I feel like I shouldn't have to have all this armor, psychological and emotional armor, when I go into a medical system.
Absolutely. Something we were talking about earlier that I think just dovetails great with this is for providers to detach their ego from their patients. And I would say this for all patients, not just fat patients, but especially fat patients, and not having an expectation of what that patient is going to do, or if that patient is going to lose weight or not lose weight, or I don't know, change their hair color. I don't know what people are expecting, but setting aside your ego, and if the patient is not doing what you expect the patient to do, not thinking that's about you. Maybe it's just about them. They've got their lives. They're independent, autonomous people who, have lives that are going to be, they're going to do what they're going to do. And also maybe what your goals for them are not going to be the best goals for them in the first place, right? So if you're telling them to lose weight, that's not necessarily a great goal. So to have somebody non-compliant about it, I personally think that's amazing. I actually also hate the words compliant versus non-compliant, because I'm always wondering, why is somebody being non-compliant? And you should always dive into that. Do they not trust what you've said? Because, you're telling them stuff that they've heard over and over again from providers that they don't trust or who've treated them poorly. How are you going about talking to your patient?
I think that that's really important, though. We were talking about this being like I'm a social worker, and I've been a social worker for many years. When I'm working with a client or a parent, I can see down the line some of the things that they're doing, and I'm like, red flag, like that's going to end up in like a wreck. But at the end of the day, it's their life, and they get to make those choices. And my job is to support them. And if they do stumble and fall, to be there to sort of help them back up, and that whatever change may happen in their lives really needs to come from them. That's when real transformative change happens. And then what can I do to support them in that and sort of guide them and really listen to what's happening to them? Because if I'm not listening and I'm not aware of what's happening in their life and I make a recommendation that then they don't carry out because they can't.
Right.
Because I'm not aware of it. So I think it is perhaps a mind shift for providers, maybe a consciousness shift in how providers are building relationships with patients, how providers are, what kind of questions that they're asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe a little bit different than me as a social worker, right? So,
right. Well, and going back to the expectation that weight loss is always the answer, or weight change is always the answer, because certainly we have people who are very, very thin and are told to gain weight. And even in eating disorder behavior, with people with eating disorders who are very, very thin, they're just told to gain weight. And while their eating disorder is often addressed almost as soon as, at least with insurance, I hear this a lot. I don't work in eating disorder clinics, but I've heard this so many times where once the person gains a certain amount of weight, they're out. Right? Like they're not done, but they are officially the right BMI. And so they're sent away. So they're not actually treated. And then of course on the other end, you have people who are the wrong BMI for quote unquote wrong BMI on the heavy side. And they're just expected to lose weight. And there's no other treatment. And so of course, if you have that expectation, if you're like, well, this person needs to change their weight in some fashion to be compliant, and then they don't, whether because they don't want to, or they don't feel there's a need, or they can't, or they do for a little bit, and then they gain weight again, or lose weight again, and then they, don't come back to you ever because they're terrified, because now you're going to treat them poorly. Yeah, technically that's a non-compliant patient, but what does non-compliance mean in that sense, right?
Are we really setting fat people up to succeed?
Right.
Or are we setting fat people up to fail?
We are absolutely setting them up to fail. Right?
And I think that needs to be acknowledged.
Absolutely.
Like, we have all these providers who are being taught and supported both through their professional organizations and the system of care that they work in to diet, but there is no evidence that dieting works past 4 years.
Yeah.
There is none. And I'm sure that there are people who lose weight and keep it off for the rest of their lives, but they are in the very, very small minority. And so why are we continuing to push a treatment that doesn't have a success rate?
Right.
Like, why are we continuing? And that actually hurts people, and that actually makes people fatter. So, like, how is that? That's I guess, when I think as an outsider to the medical community, or as a patient in the medical community, that's where the logic is kind of gets a little rough for me, because I feel like providers and medical systems talk so much about research. And it's like, I want to say, well, then why don't you actually
look at the research?
Look at the research with a fresh view, I guess. A fresh view. And to really be like, how do I serve my patient?
Right. And if I may tie it back to the money, going back to look where the money's coming from, and what sort of research is being done, and why.
Who's sponsoring it or paying for it?
Right. And I mean, I talked a little bit about this in the diet's not working episode, and it's so important to pay attention to that stuff because it affects your patient in all aspects of their life, right? And if you're having them do diets and they're gaining weight, number one, you're doing actually the opposite of what you wanted to do. Plus, you may be setting them up for further stigma. If you have somebody who starts off who looks, like sort of an average sized person, but then ends up dieting up to be supersized, you have somebody who could fairly easily be engaged in society in a positive, meaningful way to somebody who is going to have a really hard time doing that, not necessarily through any fault of their own, but because they've been told over and over and over again, like, lose weight, lose weight, lose weight, lose weight, lose weight, as they continue to gain weight. Plus, the stigma can cause its own problem, like its own weight gain issues with cortisol. And, it's just it's a vicious cycle. And we're just contributing to it when we're trying to help people. And that's what I keep thinking. If, as medical providers, our goal is to help people, and I really believe that most medical providers really, really want to help people.
I agree with you.
Then if all the research that we look at shows us that these treatments hurt people, we need to stop doing them. We just need to stop. Full stop. Do not do them. Do not have people change their weight on purpose. We need to focus on, like, if we're going to try to help people get healthy, looking at systemic issues. But even if we're looking at individual stuff, like, where can they be safe to work out? Where can they be safe to eat? Where can they get food if they live in a food desert? And how can we get rid of food deserts? And how can we make sure that people are food secure? How can we make sure that they have safe places to sleep? And then, and how can they engage in life and in the social world, especially if they're very large, and all of these things that we need to look into. And that's not even starting with the systemic oppression of a variety of groups that also needs to be addressed because it also affects all of our health.
Yep.
Yeah. Pardon me while I get off my soapbox.
I think, though, that it the urgency in my voice and probably definitely the urgency I hear in yours is that it is an urgent matter. Mm-hmm. It is very, very serious. And that's the point I'm trying to get across to providers, is that this is not okay. And this needs to stop. And I'm hoping that I feel like there's maybe an opening within medical systems, at least when I've, lately been having some conversations that people seem to be a little bit interested and, okay, maybe I'll listen. And I think that if we're going to do this system change, one of the really important points is to have patient voice, to hear patient stories. And I'm on several Facebook kind of secret groups for fat people. And there's a couple of them that are really helpful to me personally for a lot of reasons. One, it's very validating. Uh-huh. Two, I learn how to navigate systems better, or maybe there's something going on with my body that I haven't asked the doctor, I don't feel comfortable, or I have and it hasn't worked and somebody else has that issue, then I can try that thing. Usually in those groups, it has to do with skin issues and things like that, skin fold, struggles and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a huge struggle. And so, but it's really interesting in those groups because I think that medical providers would be shocked to read some of the things that fat people say about their providers or providers in general. We're talking about I'm not going to say hatred, but I would say close to that, and visceral reactions to, somebody posts a story about experience they had with a provider that was really harmful and hurtful or neglectful, and people's responses. People are angry with providers, and I don't know that providers are even aware of how angry people are, right? Because they're not going to probably say it to your face, but you might feel it when that person checks out when you're talking to them, or they get really defensive, right, or quote non-compliant. And I think that I'm one of the rarities where
Yeah,
I
you are.
actually voice,
Absolutely.
I'm not having this conversation with you, or you've stepped over the line, or no, I'm not going to get weighed, or whatever it is. Like, I don't have a problem saying no or telling the person exactly what I think. I try to do as much as I can up front so I don't have to have those battles.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I have to go to a specialist or something like that isn't someone I work on a long-term basis with. So I would like to see more people of size start to stand up if they can and tell providers no, and shifting that power dynamic. Because at the end of the day, it's my body,
Right.
and I'm in charge of what happens to it.
Right. So providers, listen to what you just said, and treat all fat patients the way that Shilo wants to be treated.
Yeah.
Just start there, right?
And there are a lot of patients who there are a lot of fat people who think that the way they're being treated is okay. That
Right,
being shamed and talked down to, and all of that is what they deserve because they're not losing weight, or they're not being successful in that. They have a, quote, what I would say, a deviant body.
Right.
Right. And so, a lot of people, I talk, even talking to my mom, and she's like, well, I wasn't very good at doing this or doing that. I was like, no, you are not to be treated with that kind of disrespect. That is not how this is supposed to work.
Absolutely.
Do you want me to come with you to your appointment? Because I will, and I will give them a piece of my mind. I mean, it just is absolutely irresponsible. And for me, I'm not putting up with shit anymore. I am not. So I try to be very professional and kind. That is my normal way of being in different systems. But if I get pushback, it's like there's a volcano in my belly that comes out of my mouth. And I'm not abusive or anything like that, but I'm real fierce. And real blunt. And people are quite shocked about it. But I would like more, anybody, does not even have to be fat people, to start standing up and saying, yeah, this is not the kind of care that I want. This is the kind of care that I want.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I hope that more providers will run into patients who start standing up for themselves.
I wanted to thank Shilo George again for joining me today and for her amazing insight. She and I ended up talking for a few hours after recording, and I am really hoping that she will agree to return for another episode in the future. Together, I really think that we can create a better and healthier world. The theme music you are hearing was composed and performed by Galen Davis.